Welcome back, everybody. We're going to be continuing in our study in the book of Ephesians today. For those of you that were with us from the beginning of this study, I would remind you that I told you that this book has a very unique place in Scripture. And since a number of you are joining here late, you haven't had the opportunity to get that background, let me explain that the book of Ephesians is unique for a couple of reasons. Primarily it is this: it's one of the only books that Paul wrote that was never intended for a particular city. I know we have this labeled as the book of Ephesians, but our best understanding of this book is that it was written originally with no title. Paul wrote this with the purpose of having it circulated to every church in every city in every location, and also with the intent of having it preserved for every church that would ever exist. Ephesians, if you will, is the owner's manual for the Christian life. If you've ever bought a new device, let's say you got one of those new smart TVs and all the features that you look into it, you know that it can be controlled by your Alexa app. It has voice recognition. It has every kind of thing, Netflix, and it has Hulu, and you know all these things about it. And you can control all kinds of things. The first thing that you get when you look at the owner's manual, the owner's manual breaks down into two basic parts. The owner's manual, the first thing is to explain to you all of the features that come with the device that you've just purchased. This is what you've got. This is the package deal. That's the first part. The second part of the owner's manual explains how to use those things. Now that you have them, now that you've spent all this money to have all these features, what's the point if you don't use any of them? It pays to go through and understand how to take advantage of all of the things that are in that package. If you will, this is the book of Ephesians. It's a foundational book. I don't mean to demean any other book in the New Testament canon, but Ephesians was written as the foundational book to help you understand all the rest of the truth of God. It is there to help you understand how to use the package you've received. And the book of Ephesians breaks down just like that owner's manual. The first half of this book goes through, this is what came with the package. When God placed salvation in your life, when God acted to save you, this is what came with it. And all you go through in the first 3 chapters is one thing after another of the things that God has done on your behalf, the riches, the wealth, the resources that are at your disposal because of salvation. The second half then explains how to use it. Having these things and not accessing, having these resources, not using them, is the foolishness of life. And this is what we have here in the second half. And that's what we're studying now as we're dealing with chapters 4 through 6. We're in the second half of the owner's manual. How do you use the things God has given you? If you remember that, it started in chapter 4, verse 1, and Paul describes it as saying you need to walk worthy. That's how Paul describes the Christian life. It is a walk. It is something visible and seen that is characterized by certain things. And the entirety of these last 3 chapters are to let you understand, help you find a way to act, to live that is consistent with, if you recall this word, in balance with your identity. That's the whole issue. Are you in balance? What God has done is the actions of your life, is the character that you display in the walk of life consistent with what God has done with the salvation He has provided. Our walk, our manner of living should be in balance with that, and that's what we're dealing with here. And we've been building an idea. Paul wants us to see that what character should mark the Christian. What puts us in that? If you will, to put it another way, if you are supposed to be children of God, do you display the character of that family? And so Paul has been laying out for us the things that make us look like what we are. Things that are consistent with the identity we've been given. We began there with the idea of humility. Humility. We are a different kind of people. In a world that is only concerned with itself, in a world that is nothing but self-centered, we are supposed to be a people that puts others ahead of ourselves, marked by that, making others more important than ourselves. We're supposed to be marked by a unity. Where the world is bickering and battling, we are supposed to be unified under one Lord, under one faith, under one body of truth, under one set type of character that should mark us in life. We're supposed to have an aspect of that character, loving care for one another. We're supposed to have an honesty in both word and deed. We're supposed to be marked by hard work. I want you to try this one. Anytime a person hires a Christian, it should be the best employee they've got. We should be displaying a kind of character, a kind of work ethic that the world has abandoned. And it's not just for us. Whereas the world is always working for itself to get ahead, what is described here in these pages is that our work is to set aside a margin, an extra, that we might be generous with others. And now as we come to chapter 5, and we're looking at verses 15 through 17, we see the next aspect that identifies this character that should mark the believer's walk in life. We are now talking about wisdom. This is now Paul describing wisdom. And if you remember from last time when we were together, I gave you a distinction here, because how God views wisdom and how the world views wisdom are not always in sync. As we said in the time of the writing of this book, the Greek world, the Roman world at the time, had two basic views. There was the Greek view of wisdom, and the Greek view of wisdom was pretty much what we've adopted in the Western world. And it said this: wisdom was like a philosopher who came up with some incredible ideas no one had ever thought of before. It was a statesman that came up with new concepts to govern a nation. It was someone who had deep ideas that no one had thought of and was eloquent and could argue those ideas and lay out thoughts that were deeper and beyond what most people could do. It was intelligence, it was information, was largely seen as the basis of wisdom. The Jewish model was very different. It is not that the Jew didn't appreciate intelligence. It's not that the Jew did not appreciate eloquence. It was not that the Jew didn't appreciate knowledge. But the Jew said this: any information you had, any training you had that did not directly make you wiser in the actions of life was not wisdom. The Jew could see someone that was a great philosopher that came up with a philosophy and a concept that was, frankly, was stupid. It didn't help life. It didn't help people see things any more clearly. It didn't help people see things or do things better. We have that today. There are people who spin great theories in the world of business that fall flat completely. They don't take off. There are people that come up with great ideas in the world of academics, and they tell us great philosophies, and they tell us great things about psychology that, quite frankly, damage people. They come up with ideas of raising children that, quite frankly, create little monsters. There are people in government that come up with great ideas and new thoughts about how we're going to govern and how we're going to use our tax dollars, which turn out to be damaging to the people they claim to be trying to help. Having a lot of information, having a great deal of intelligence does not guarantee wisdom. And to the Jew then, to walk as wise, steeped as they were in the Old Testament, was to walk and act in ways where wisdom impacted life for the better. The wise man made wise decisions about how to live. And to them, someone who was very smart but did not live wisely simply became the fool. And that's what Paul is after here in this same description of wisdom. In verses 15 through 17, he's looking at the same idea, calling it the walk. And he says, if you have your King James there, it says to walk circumspectly. I believe the NASB, the New American Standard Bible, says be careful. But the NIV, I think, really captures the emphasis. It's an emphatic form, and here's what it reads in verse 15. Be very careful then how you live. Not as unwise, but as wise. Be very careful. The whole idea in the Greek here is an exacting type of decision making, of being careful because there are dangers around you. And I want you to understand, the Bible talks about life in a very real way. If God is anything, he's honest with us. I always worry about Christians that try to sell the idea of Christianity with this idea, this notion that God just comes in and solves your problems. Life turns out to be good from here on out. You never have another issue in life. That's not how life is lived. Scripture is very honest. In the book of Job, Job was a godly man, the most godly man of his age. I think we have to admit Job had some problems. And Job describes life in this way. He says, man is prone to trouble as the sparks fly upward. If you've ever done a fireplace in your home, if you've ever had a campfire and you stirred it with that stick and seen those sparks just blast up, he's saying that's life. That's life. Life is going to come with some troubles. Jesus warned his followers that if they hated me, guess what? They're going to hate you. At what level did they hate him? Look at the level, looked at the efforts they did to silence him. And he says that can be the world coming at you. He warned us with this. Satan, he said, is moving around like a roaring lion looking for someone he can devour. He's looking for someone who's playing the fool. He's looking for someone who is not watching and is not careful to tear them down and tear them apart. The Christian life is not a carefree stroll with a plastered smile on your face, skipping through fields of flowers. God said the wise person accepts that life has problems, and they walk very carefully. They weigh their decisions carefully in a dangerous world. To walk any other way, God says, is to walk as a fool. And last week I told you this, from Scripture's perspective, the world is full of fools. The simple reason is this. Here was the dividing line, as you said, from Proverbs 1:7. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom, but fools despise wisdom and discipline. That's our dividing line. What makes you wise? To accept that God's idea about life, God's ideas about character, God's ideas about morality are the ones that make sense. Those that want to live life, remember we said this last time, they want to live life as if there was no God. It's not that they necessarily don't think there is a God, but they're going to make a choice to live in life as if what God said makes no difference at all. This is the dividing line. And there's a very small cadre of people who have come to understand this and have come to salvation and said God's plan makes more sense. That is the dividing line in wisdom. Understand for us, as believers, with salvation came a gift. We are not going to be made the most intelligent people on the planet. We're not going to be the most eloquent people on the planet. We're not going to be the most powerful. We're not going to be the most... But we are going to be the wisest. Not because of any great skill, but because we recognize that God's ideas make more sense. And that is the dividing line between the two. Of course, what we see in the world is they see it in just the reverse, don't they? We're the fools. We're the ones that they see as not being in step with what's really going on. But God has made a distinction there. And God has said this about the fool. When you act as if there is no God, you can then justify almost anything you do. And this is how the world lives. The world comes up with a new idea that merely is an idea that justifies the sin they want to commit, they want to pursue, and they call that wisdom. And then they mock anyone who challenges that. So, of course, we have to be in the crosshairs of the world. The world is amazingly capable of ignoring the obvious and calling it intelligence, insight. And we see that in many places. Now, our passage that we're dealing with, we said last time, has a four-part outline, four aspects of this. First off, we have to understand that there are principles for life. There are rules, not for salvation, but for success. To live wisely, to successfully deal with life, there are rules, there are principles God has laid out. We need to grasp those and use them. Secondly, we need to know there are consequences if we won't live by those principles. Sin has an impact on life. Third, we need to know that there's a limited amount of time to act on those principles. And fourth, we need to understand that there's a purpose for those principles. Now, last time we did the first two aspects of this. That was in verse 15. Read that again. Be very careful then how you live, not as unwise, but as wise. That's the breakdown there. We are to be careful how we are living. We are to be serious about what God has said. We are to identify actions that are right and act on them. We are to identify sin and avoid it. Wisdom is the capacity to recognize the difference between the two. And we've laid out examples of this. There are consequences for sin in life. No sin is just something you stumbled on. It's because you weren't watching. Wisdom is the capacity to see. Sin is not a sad accident. It's a dumb decision. It is missing the signs. We are to be wise and not walk like the fool. And that brings up our next point that we're going to see here in verse 16 as we open this up. Not only does a wise person know his life's principles, but he knows that his time is limited. A Christian has limits. Our destiny is eternity, but our existence is in a limited, prescribed, and measured period of time. And if you don't walk wisely, God doesn't give you a do-over. You don't get a second chance. There is no reincarnation. There is not where God will say, well, let's try it again. This is the life you are given. And understand this. There is no greater sign of wisdom, no greater sign of the lack of wisdom than in the manner in which we use time. Time is our dividing line. I'll ask you a question, those who are out there and watching this. And I can't see your responses, but I guess there'll be a few people getting an elbow in the ribs at times when you think about this. How many of you have unfinished projects at home? How many of you have not completed the task? That's the first question. Let me ask you this. Why are they unfinished? Why don't you ever get to things? For most of us, those are not questions we'd like to answer. One of the greatest sins in life is a sin we really don't want to identify as sin. It's called procrastination. The sin of procrastination. Most often things aren't done not because we can't do them. They aren't done because we don't do them. We just don't get to them. There's a classic that we have here that we use. This is our classic excuse, and this is how we always excuse ourselves and say, this is why I was planning on doing that. You ever use that one? I was planning to do that. I was going to get to that. Let me ask you this. If you're so sure you had a plan, let's go to just a couple of other questions. Why don't you tell me about that plan? First off, what's the starting date and time for it? If you're going to get to that, if you're going to get that project done, tell me, is it going to happen tomorrow morning at 9? Or is it going to happen next Wednesday afternoon? When are you going to get there? Let's ask another thing about that plan. Give me the particulars. Outline that plan for me. What are the steps that are going to get you there, that you're going to go through? What's the beginning point? What resources have you brought to bear? What things have you marshaled and put together to make a plan? Because if all your plan is a vague concept that says, I really intend to get to that, I really know it needs to be done, but you have no real purpose, you have no real structure to it, it's not a plan. It's an excuse. It's putting something off and saying, I'll get to it at some point if you just leave me alone. But what you're really saying is, really, I have no intention of getting to it, but I'd still like you to leave me alone. There are so many people that never finish what they start. Reading through, I'm a big buff on history. I like art history and different things. There's always stories. The person with the unfinished symphony and the unfinished painting and the unfinished sculpture. And they always talk about this and what a tragedy this is that this great artist didn't get to finish this. But in almost all the lives of the people that we studied and I looked at and that had these unfinished works, that was the thing they were working on at the end when they died. And before that, there's a whole body of things they did complete, things they got done. And their death came while they were still producing, still making things happen. And I don't see that as a tragedy. I see that as a person that was working on something, that was seeking to use every moment they had to achieve a goal right up to the end. And folks, most of us are not going to end life having tragically missed out on completing something that we were working hard to get done. Most of us never got started. Most of us never even began the project. There was no sculpture in process. It's just a rock sitting in the backyard. And you never chipped a piece off of it. We don't get things done because we don't plan. We don't do something that we see here. Look at verse 16 as Paul describes this. Making the most of every opportunity because the days are evil. The most literal translation there is redeeming the time. Making the most or redeeming the time because the days are evil. And I want you to notice that definite article there. This is not a time, this is not some time, this is the time. Scripture uses that definite article a number of times. Each time it talks about time in general. Frequently that comes up. Making the most of your time is how the New American Standard does it. But time is a limited commodity. Peter said this in 1 Peter 1:17, pass the time of your sojourning here in fear. Pass the time. Use it with, why in fear? That you might waste the moments, that you don't redeem the opportunities. Job said this, all the days are of my appointed time. God has taken and measured this. He has measured it out to each of us, and we do not know how much there is. But we are to redeem all that there is of it. I love this one from Paul in Acts 20:24. He used this illustration more than once, but he says he is trying to finish the course. The literal Greek is ton drama nomou, and it says this, the course of me. understand this. Paul wasn't talking about the race of life in which everybody is entered. He was talking about the race of life that was his appointed race. The time and the course that was given to him to complete in the appointed time God had given him. And he said, I want to complete that. And understand this about a race. Because Paul was able to say that in his life, wasn't he? I have finished the course. I am ready to be offered. How many of us are going to have that moment in life? But Paul said this, God appointed a starting point, he appointed a completion point, and he laid out a course along the way with things I was to do to get from point A to point B, and I did it. This is what Paul was after. The course of me. God has given the course of me, and I want to finish that completely before I'm done. Psalms tells us that our time is like a hand's breadth before God. Redeem it. Some of you are old enough like me to remember a time of S&H green stamps and blue chip stamps that you took and you saved them all up and you pasted them as books, and then what you do? You went to the redemption center. You redeemed them. You cashed them in. Gathering them all up, but not cashing them in. Taking the time and then applying it is the issue. Did you cash it in? Are you making the most of the moments? James, in chapter 4, verses 13 to 15, talks about this, the aspect of procrastination. You may have run into this, where James says, don't tell me about tomorrow. Don't say tomorrow I'm going to do this, tomorrow I'm going to get to that, because you don't know if you've got tomorrow. Understand this, James is not attacking the idea of making plans. He's attacking the idea of putting things off because you don't have a plan. I'll do that tomorrow. I'll get to that later. And God is saying, you don't know if you've got it. You need to lay out plans, understanding this. You don't know if God's going to take your life tonight. You don't know what God's plans for you are, but you need to redeem the time now. For the Christian, life is built around a clear understanding of time. It is so important that it is placed here as a description of wisdom. This is Paul, he says, live wise, and here is it shown, by managing time. This is the greatest proof of wisdom in our lives, is how we use time. If there's anything you need to take an effort in understanding, in measuring, in telling yourself, this is what I do, what do you do with time? How do you use it? The word here is very special. The most common word for time in the Greek is chronos. It's from which we get chronometer. It's how we talk about a watch, time in measured points. But this word is katros, and it is often translated as eras, but the other thing is often translated as opportunities. Make the most of opportunities. That's how my New International Version talk it, taking opportunities. We redeem opportunities. In the course of studying for this lesson, I came across a description of a Greek statue. I believe it was done by Lysippus, if I got the name right, or if I'm pronouncing that right. And it's a statue of the god called Opportunity. It was an interesting statue in that there was this large, powerful man with winged feet. And he had this great forelock of hair wound up that draped down along the front of his chest, but in the back of his head, he was completely bald. A number of you out there like me are getting more and more like the God of opportunity. But here was the whole idea. Opportunity comes at you with speed on winged feet. And the whole point was you had to watch for its approach, because you had to seize it as it came to you, because once it got past, there was nothing to grab onto. And this was the whole image of this God, of this opportunity. And there's a whole description that was carved into the base of the statue describing this whole aspect. You have to seize opportunities. Napoleon said that there comes in every battle a moment, a time, in which you can either seize it and see it and move on to victory, or miss it and know defeat. That is what we have to watch for. We have to have the wisdom to be watching and carefully walking, and we have to have this wisdom to grasp and use time. Notice why he says we should be careful with our time. He says, because the days are evil. Now, again, I want you to remember our setting. This book was not just written to Ephesus. He wasn't writing to a group of people in Ephesus saying, your days, your particular world. Now, it's true, and we can talk about that in a second. Ephesus had its problem. I don't know if you're familiar with the city of Ephesus, but Ephesus had the temple to Diana, or Artemis of the Ephesians, depending on which language you dealt with. She would have those two names. And it was one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, and it was a massive faith that dominated life in Ephesus. And the church was not viewed too kindly because it challenged the dominance of Artemis of the Ephesians. And there were laws passed to structure Christians. There was things, but the whole thing that impacted this, Artemis's worship was based around sexuality. There were hundreds and hundreds of temple prostitutes, male and female. The worship was orgies. The worship was sexuality on a grand and gross scale. And that kind of activity bled into the city. And these people were coarse. They were disgusting in almost every manner. And the church was an annoyance. And as I said, they passed laws to try to control the church. They tried to freeze them out of business. And the church was under constant pressure. The days were evil. But again, understand that this book was not written just to Ephesus. This book was written to every church in every city in every age. What is Paul saying? What days are evil? What days are evil, folks? All the days are evil. All of the days, in every time. Understand what Scripture tells us, that this world is the world controlled by Satan. This world is the world that he is the God of. It is his culture. It is his values that dominate this world. We are outsiders here. Every age is evil. If we're looking at our times and the things we're dealing with right now, the attack is constant. The church always has to be vigilant. It has to be wise and watch for that. What happened in Ephesus was tragic. This is a church that was founded by the Apostle Paul. He spent 3 years there. This is a church where he sent his protege, Timothy, who was one of the first pastors there for a number of years. And yet when you come to the book of Revelation, God writes a letter to this church and says, you are leaving your first love. If you don't do something, I'm going to end your ministry. You understand, God can take away the ministry of churches and of Christians who fail to seize the moment, who fail to combat evil, and fail to use time well. That church faded, and there is no church there. It went away entirely. And that can happen at any place at any time because the days are evil. We're facing that all the time. We're wondering what the next issue is going to be. Right now, we're all locked down at home. We're looking at this coronavirus things, and I'm hearing Christians talk back and forth about all sorts of things. I've heard a number of them wonder, is this a sign of the end times? Maybe. All of the prophecies that need to be fulfilled are done. God can come, his son can return at any time. I'm always hesitant to want to jump to such conclusions because of the number of people that have made us look like fools in the world by making predictions and saying it's going to happen. But it could be a sign of the end. Others have wondered at what other things are going to come out of it. Some Christians are saying this could be the beginning of a great revival. People are at home. People are facing a crisis that is causing them to reflect. They have to be with their families. They're finally actually thinking about life. They've had to pause for a time. And maybe we're going to see a United States come out of this that's going to recognize a spiritual need. God's done it before. He can do it again. Some are wondering this. Are we going to come out of this and we're going to be the beginning of a turmoil and a persecution of the church? Some of you may have read this. I responded to an article from the New York Times that literally claimed that Christians, that our belief in God, our denial of science was the claim. We're probably the leading cause of the explosion of the coronavirus. This was in a major periodical in our nation. Maybe they're going to use that as an excuse. Maybe this is going to be the beginning of even more evil times. Paul warned us of that. Paul's major warning here is that all times have evil in them. But he also said this in 2 Timothy. To Timothy, he says, evil men will grow worse and worse. Why? I love this from Romans 1. He tells us that men will work at inventing new sins because they aren't satisfied with the old ones. And they will be proud of how clever they were with what they create. That's how the world acts. And look at anything we've ever invented. We're in the age of information, the internet. What's the number one use of the internet? Pornography. We are now dealing with robotics, and we've come up with all these great kinds of things in factories and things with our robotics, and we're talking about robotic aids that are going to help older people and so forth. But you know what the new industry emerging is at? Sexual robots. We can pervert anything. Humanity is clever in his sin. No one was said he wasn't smart. They just said he's a fool. And this is what we're creating. Redeem the time. This is in the middle voice in the Greek, and it literally means to buy it up. Buy it up. Gather it in and control it. Invest it. Know what you're doing with it. Take control of it so you know what you're going to accomplish. Don't be a Christian who's always going to do something. You ever had that one? Somebody gets up and says, oh, I was going to do that. I was going to do that. Well, maybe you were, and maybe you weren't. But most of us live life talking about something we're going to do that we just don't do. People have talked about this, but it comes down to this. Time spent is our greatest resource. Time spent is our greatest display of love. Do we take the time to spend time with each other? Do we set aside, do we purpose time for our relationships with our husband, with our wife, with our children, with our families, with that neighbor that needs to hear the gospel? Do we purpose time? Are you purposing time to develop a ministry that you always talked about? I'm going to get started. I'm going to serve God. When? At what time are you going to do it? Can you find time to hit the gym every day and never find time to crack open your Bible? Can you find time to be on top of every statistic of every sport you know about? You know every batting average and every completion percentage, and you know all the stats and standings of your stars going back for a generation. Can you rattle those off, and you cannot find the verses to share with someone to tell them about their need for Jesus Christ? What are you doing with your time? Is it hard for you to ever make it to church because you're just too busy, yet you never miss a function you want to make it to? How do you value time? How do you use it well? What stupid distractions always keep you from doing the wise thing? There's a story in Scripture that was always interesting to me. A king was going to leave, and he had a prisoner that was critical, and he told his servant, keep this guy under control. Don't lose him. This guy needs to be watched. The king came back, and the prisoner had escaped. And he asked his servant, what happened? And the servant had this excuse. While your servant was busy here and there, the man was gone. His life depended. He was told that his life was forfeit if he didn't hold on to this prisoner. And his only excuse was, I was busy doing stuff. He couldn't even tell what it was. He couldn't come up with some critical thing that happened in the kingdom that said, if I wasn't doing this, your kingdom could fall. Nothing important happened. It was just doing silly stuff here and there. Does that sound like the excuses we have? Well, that's our third point, our issue of time. And now I want you to look at verse 17. Here's our last one. Therefore, do not be foolish, but understand what the Lord's will is. The wise person has something. The principles that they pursue in life, the principles that they make a part of themselves, change them in an interesting way. Notice what that says there. Do not be a fool, but instead understand what the Lord's will is. I like that word. That's very important. Most often we talk about the will of God as some kind of mystery. If I only knew what God wanted me to do, I'm searching for God's will. We treat God's will like we're Indiana Jones in the temple. We're trying to get that statue off there without getting shot by the poison darts or rolled over by the giant boulder. It is not a problem to be solved or a riddle or something to be searched out that God is hidden. It is something to be understood. Do you get what that says? There's a point at which you can have an understanding of what God's will is. There's a little book I recommend highly to you. I don't know if you are a big fan of Dr. MacArthur or not, but John MacArthur has this very small book that I really recommend. It's that Found God's Will. And I recommend to each one of you to read that sometime because it lays out some interesting points. And it simply goes through this. It says the beginning point for understanding God's will, for finding it, is to look for what God said His will is. there's a beginning point. God has a will for you. The first one is God's will was that you be saved. 1 Timothy 2:4 can talk about that. He wants you to be filled with the Spirit after you're saved. Ephesians 5:18. He wants you to be sanctified, to build yourself up into a pattern of living that follows the standards of God. 1 Thessalonians 4:3. He wants you to have an attitude of submission. That's from 1 Peter 2:13 through 15. And God's will also includes the willingness to suffer if it's required of you. 1 Peter 2:20. And it's also God's will that you pause long enough to see what God is doing so that you can be thankful because you see the actions of God. 1 Thessalonians 5:18. Start there and then understand you begin to see what God's will is. When you have put the time in, when you have had the wisdom to stop and consider what God's will is, to look into the mind of God. Do you understand what your Bible is? It's the opportunity to look into the mind and thinking of God, to see how He thinks. When you make that a daily pattern, when you set the discipline, the wisdom to choose to do that, when you take the time to know what God has said, you begin to understand how He thinks. And then suddenly, in the daily aspects of life, those decisions you're struggling over, those times when you say, I only wish I knew what God wanted me to do, it suddenly is something of an understanding. Not finding a lost secret, but an understanding that says, thinking like God, I'll make decisions in the wisdom of God. And suddenly you can make, what ministry should I be involved in? Should I be involved in this relationship? Should I be going here? Should I take that job? Those things you're struggling with suddenly get very simple when you are thinking in the mindset of God. Ask yourself these questions about how you're thinking. Are you struggling with this because it's something you really want, knowing it's not something that's good for you? That often will be changed. We hide from these facts because we don't stop and consider the wisdom of God. It's not a secret. It's not something to be found. It isn't something God has stashed somewhere and hopes you discover it. It's changing how you think. It's the discipline to stop and be careful how you live, to recognize the dangers of sin and to avoid them, to take and manage your time, and then gain an understanding that changes how you think in life. Next week, we'll go into verse 18. If you want to shut down, we're going to be done for the day, and thank you for your time.